So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Conway Hall. Thank you for coming to this first event in a series of events to mark the 40th birthday of the London Review of Books. The proximate occasion for this event is the publication by Faber and Faber of this rather sumptuous book entitled The London Review of Books, An Incomplete History. We hope that it's considerably incomplete. It's a kind of annual, a bit like the Beano Annual, a sort of bumper book of the LRB. And you might suspect that it would be not extremely interesting, but actually it really is. So it's full of quite fascinating things, sort of images of text that's been edited, letters from people, descriptions of the history of the magazine and so on. It's really, really good. And we hope, or at least Faber and Faber does, that you will purchase copies of this book at the end of the evening, and there'll be a bookshop at the back. The first issue of the London Review of Books appeared on the 25th of October, 1979, as a 28-page insert in the New York Review of Books. And I have here a facsimile of that edition. And looking through it, it's really quite interesting. We have John Bailey writing about William Golding, Carl Miller on V.S. Naipaul, William Empson on Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, Francis Winter on Heathcote Williams. And that's interesting because we've just published Heathcote's book about Boris Johnson. It's called A Study in Depravity. And it's on sale at the bookshop too, and I hope at the back. This is essentially a sales operation this evening. So there's Heathcote Williams, Frank Commode, and then, of course, the most extraordinary thing is a piece by Wynne Godley, the economist. Wynne Godley asks if Britain will have to withdraw from Europe. 40 years later, here we are. So not very much has changed, you might think. Certainly it looks much the same. Carl Miller, who was the first editor of the London Review of Books, wrote in the first edition, wildly exaggerating the circulation of the magazine, as editors used to do. I just quote one sentence from this. Literary journalism in this country shares at present in the country's contracted and suspended state, a state that will not improve if we keep our appointment with the worsening world recession predicted for the new year. Of course, things have changed. The world is very different. And what we will be doing this evening is talking, at least in part, about the things that have changed and the things that haven't changed. And with me to discuss these things are, on my immediate right, Mary Kay Wilmers, editor of the London Review of Books. Mary Kay was with the paper from the very beginning, first as deputy editor, then as co-editor, then in 1992 as editor. Before working at the LRB, Mary Kay was deputy editor of The Listener, which some of you will remember as a very important BBC magazine, which has a great relationship to the London Review.
TLS.
And she was at TLS as fiction editor, also as fiction editor at the TLS. She's always been as much a writer as an editor. A collection of her essays, Human Relations and Other Difficulties, appeared last year, again with Faber. You're beginning to suspect a relationship there. She is also the author of a family memoir, The Eitingans. On Mary Kay's right is Andrew O'Hagan. Andrew is one of Britain's most distinguished novelists and essayists. His first job out of university was as an editorial assistant at the London Review of Books, which he joined in 1991 and stayed with us for 4 years. He was for many years a contributing editor at the LRB and is now editor-at-large. His most recent books are the novel The Illuminations and The Secret Life, 3 Stories of the Digital Age, a book of extended reportage essays. Next to Andrew, at the end of the row here, also one of Britain's leading novelists and essayists, is John Lanchester. He too worked at the LRB as an editor, in his case between 1987 and 1996, when the sensational success of his first novel, The Debt to Pleasure, convinced him to devote his life to writing. His most recent novel is The Wall, a bleak parable for the age of global warming. Now to our special guests. First, on my immediate left, Sheng Yun. Sheng Yun is contributing editor at the Shanghai Review of Books and a much-valued contributor to the LRB. There's actually a delightful article by Sheng Yun in the present issue on Chinese millennials. Sheng Yun was instrumental in the expansion of the London Review Bookshop's empire from 14 Berry Place to Shanghai. And thanks to her, there are now two boutique bookshops, two boutique sections of large Chinese bookshops in Shanghai, dedicated to the London Review Bookshop and curated by our booksellers here in London. Finally, on my far left is someone who really needs no introduction. Alan Bennett, one of the most prolific and creative figures of our age, as an actor, director, and writer of plays and fiction. Everybody here will know this, but not everyone here will know that Alan has been an utterly loyal supporter of the London Review of Books from the moment of its birth. He is, in a way, our godfather. He has written for the paper on many occasions and has become well known for his annual diary. Now, the format of this evening will be as follows. There will be 4 10-minute discussions of aspects of the history of the paper and its purposes and so on. And interspersed between those discussions, Alan will read briefly from some of his writings for the London Review of Books. At the end of the evening, there will be time for questions. And then finally, I suppose I ought to introduce myself. I'm Nicholas Spice. I joined the London Review of Books in 1982 as publisher, and here I am still. So, off we go. I'd like to start really with the history of the paper, a few of the facts around how it came into being. Mary Kay, how was it that the paper came into being?
Oh, it came into being because there was a lockout at the Times, and so there was no TLS. And a few years before that, something similar had happened in New York. It was not a lockout, but there was something at the New York Times, a strike, and there was no New York Times. And in that period of no New York Times, Robert Silvers started the New York Review of Books. So when the London Times disappeared, Frank Kermode wrote a piece saying, well, in New York, when this sort of thing happened, they did something, whereas we just sit here and do nothing. So we started the London Review of Books just to show that we could do it too.
And I think it was probably a condition, wasn't it, by the New York Review of Books. I mean, the New York Review of Books were interested in expanding their market in the UK and Europe, especially in the UK. They had been very, very successful in America, and they saw this as an opportunity to expand their market in the UK. But the approach came from Frank Kermode, did it, in Stuart, Hampshire? Or was it their idea? Was it the New York Review of Books idea?
I thought it was the New York Review of Books idea, but I wouldn't actually know. But Frank Kermode was on the board, Stuart Hampshire was on the board, but I don't think they did anything except represent Silvers.
Yes, but I do remember it being said that the New York Review of Books really only went into this venture on condition that the editorial team would be Carl, you, and Susanna, who had been together on The Listener, hadn't you?
Susanna Clapp, yeah.
Susanna Clapp.
Yes, we had been together on The Listener. I don't know that they said on. I mean, they offered the editorship to Carl.
Yes.
And Carl chose Susanna and me, since we'd both worked with him, and had, given up our jobs because of him.
Yes.
So, yes, he
put it together. He
re-employed us.
He employed you. And I mean, at the very beginning, it was a very small team.
Yeah.
3 people.
And one of the things you see quite clearly from the book is how precarious it was at the beginning. I mean, at 40 years distance, it's sort of amazing that, this great steady ship that you see now.
Yeah, but that was...
and then make it look like it could close at any point.
Well, yes, but that was the editorial mode.
Yeah.
If I remember,
still is.
It wasn't just the mode though, because I remember not very long after I joined in January 87, the New York Review announced that it was starting a European edition.
Yeah.
And, it didn't seem, I mean, the worry was very genuine because we thought we might lose all the advertisers, lose all the contributors. Our circulation was, still in single-figure thousands at that point. And so there was a kind of precariousness
You mean
about
the
it.
precariousness to them, not to us?
No, to us, that, as it were, if we lose all our contributors and lose all our advertisers, I mean, that seemed a thing that was possible that might happen, as of spring 1987. Because I remember writing home saying, I'm not sure I'm still going to have a job.
Well, I don't know. My sense of it is that a lot of it was a manner of speaking.
Really?
Thanks for telling me now.
Well, it's interesting, John, that you say this, because I have a distinct memory of lying in bed next to Lotte, my wife, and saying exactly the same thing at that point, saying, I'm not sure I can have a job soon. Really interesting, that. But equally well, I can remember Carl Miller at meetings, adjusting his spectacles and saying in his inimitable voice, we have no material for the next issue. We are going to have to close. He used to say that. Do you remember him saying that?
Yeah, he talked about folding the paper all the time. Yeah.
He'd talk about closing the paper all the time.
And there being a hole in the page. Quite late on, there was often a hole in the page, meaning they were waiting for a piece.
Waiting for a piece. But he had a very gloomy sense of the future, didn't he? I mean, it really was extremely kind of... Sheng Yun, does this kind of ring any bells with you? I mean, in Shanghai, do people say that kind of thing? Do they say, we have nothing for the next issue, I think we'll have to close?
No, not really.
So who owns the Shanghai Review of Books?
Oh, there's a media group.
It's a media group, so a large group.
Large group.
Of
So
business
only a
people.
small section of it. So we don't have a say of closing the paper.
No, it's not up to you.
No.
I can see that. Now, how long has it been published?
It's since 2008.
Yes.
Yeah, we supplemented to Oriental Morning Post.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 2017, we lose the paper form and it become a digital daily now.
So it's a digital daily?
Yes.
My goodness.
Every day.
We'll certainly return to that, because that must be a lot of work.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there we go. I mean, just very quickly, before we move on to Alan's first reading, I think it's worth kind of recalling what it was like in the early days. I mean, I joined when the paper had moved from its office above Dillon's bookshop in Mallet Street and moved to 6A Bedford Square, which is now a very poshly refurbished Georgian office. But it wasn't very poshly refurbished then, was it?
No, you have the wonderful description of Carl coming in when, after it had been burgled or something, or after a snowstorm. No, it wasn't posh. But
it wasn't posh. Yes, he came in through the door, which had been gemmed open, so it had a jagged edges. And he used to wear a kind of Snoopy hat and a kind of airman's hat and a large fur-lined coat with fur collar.
Yeah.
And he sort of, his case, and he sort of bombed through this gap without missing a beat. I mean, he really didn't miss a beat. He just came straight through, sat down at his desk and started telling people to do things. He didn't miss anything at all. So it was a very different thing from what it is now. I mean, it's interesting now we have circulation of 78,000. We have offices on 3 floors of 28 Little Russell Street. We have a bookshop and a cafe. But it really wasn't like that then. And I think I'd just say one other thing before moving on to Alan, which is that it's remarkable that Mary Kay has edited or been involved in the editing of every single issue of the London Review of Books since it started. And each issue is 50,000 words. A year's worth of issues is about a third longer than the Bible. So she's edited around 1,000 editions of this paper. And the relentlessness of that twice monthly cycle is really incredible. So there we go. So Alan, would you like to read to us?
I think I'm just the cheese in the sandwich.
What did he say?
I've kept a diary for almost as long as the London Review has been in existence. It's getting a problem now because so very little happens to me. But so most of these entries are in the past, but and I won't put the date on. The date was an early skirmish with Carl Miller, in the sense that he didn't want dates in the diary. And I apparently said, well, a diary without dates is like a corset without stays. But this didn't carry any weight with him either. Anyway, Weston Supermare. To see Mum at Weston. I sit in the dining room of the home while they locate her coat. 2 old ladies are waiting for their lunch, which won't happen for at least another hour. It went through my mind it was pineapple, says one, but I wouldn't swear to it. You have to watch her, says the other, pointing to an empty place. She'll have all the bread. Mum's memory is almost gone, leaving her suffused with a general benevolence. I've always liked you, she says to one of the other residents, and plants a kiss on her slightly startled cheek. It's a beautiful day, and we walk on the sands. Has Gordon been to see you, I ask. Oh, yes, she says happily, though I'm saying he has, I don't know who he is. Do you know who I am? She peers at me. Oh, yes, you're my son, aren't you? And what's my name? Ah, now then. And she laughs as if this is not information any reasonable person could expect her to have. But it doesn't distress her, so it doesn't distress me. We have our lunch, our sandwiches, on a hill outside Weston, with a vast view over Somerset. She wants to say, what a grand view, but her words are going now too. Oh, she exclaims, what a big lot of about. There are sheep in the field. I know what they are, she says, but I don't know what they're called. Thus Wittgenstein is routed by my mother. In the evening, I often bike round Regent's Park. Tonight, I'm mooning along the inner circle past Bedford College when a distraught woman dashes out into the road and nearly fetches me off. She and her friend have found themselves locked in and climbed over the gate, or rather she has. Her friend Mary hasn't made it, and there, laid along the top of one of the 5-barred gates, is a plump 60-year-old lady, one leg either side of the gate, bawling to her friend to hurry up. I climb over and try and assess the situation. Good, says Mary, her cheek pressed into the gate. I can see you're of a scientific turn of mind. Her faith in science rapidly evaporates when I try moving her leg and she yells with pain. It's at this point we become aware of an audience. 3 Chinese in the regulation rig-out of embassy officials are watching the pantomime, smiling politely, and clearly not sure if this is a pastime or a predicament. Eventually, they're persuaded to line up on the other side of the gate. I hoist Mary over, and she rolls comfortably down into their outstretched arms. There's much smiling and bowing. Mary's friend says all's well that ends well. Mary says she's laddered both her stockings, and I cycle on my way. The few archaeologists I've come across in life were shy, retiring, and mildly eccentric. The archaeologists on television are loud, unprepossessing, and extrovert. Their loudness and over-enthusiasm to be accounted for, I suppose, by the need to inject some immediacy into a process which, if properly undertaken, is slow, painstaking, and more often than not, dull. Sir Mortimer Wheeler probably started the rot, and then there was Glyn Daniel and his bow ties, and today it's Tony Robinson, capering about professing huge excitement because of the uncovering of the entirely predictable foundations of a Benedictine priory at Coventry. His enthusiasm is anything but infectious and almost reconciles one to the bulldozer. And there's always a spurious time limit, making it another version of ground force. where a transformation has to be wrought in the space of 3 days. The timetable of the resurrection would just have suited the program makers. The angel appearing to Mary Magdalene in the garden was probably Alan Titchmarsh. And this is an entry from New York. A sign on 7th Avenue at Sheridan Square. Ears pierced, with or without pain. I'm reading a book on Kafka. It's a library book, and someone has marked a passage in the margin with a long, wavering line. I pay the passage special attention without finding it particularly rewarding. As I turn the page, the line moves. It's a long, dark hair. That's it.
I'd like now to talk a little bit about editing, about the editing process. I think it's entirely understandable that people basically assume that magazines are primarily the work of writers, that without writers you can't have good magazines. Well, of course, that's true in a very elementary sense. But really what is also enormously important is the process of editing. Editors don't tend to be particularly well known, and what they do is not all that well understood by people who haven't actually done it. But just as writers are important for magazines, actually writers without good editors are really not enough. And so in a sort of way, editing is the key to the whole process. Now, in the early days of the London Review of Books, back in the pre-digital era, or perhaps one should say particularly in the pre-desktop publishing era, the editing process was extremely laborious in that it would require commissioning. And then what would happen after I mean, did the writers come with their pieces into the office? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the single biggest thing that's changed about the way papers work is that everything used to be in person. People would deliver their copy in person.
Mm.
And
sometimes sit there while it was being edited in front of them.
And the completely terrifying thing that Carl Miller in particular used to do is he used to like going through people's copy in person. And I think
to make you sit back.
To make you sit next to it and mark things. And I think that was partly that, and the thing about going into the room with all the editors sitting around was part of the reason why the poet Michael Hoffman once observed that writing for the LRB gives you cancer.
I have to say I've just been through that. And, yeah.
And I remember the first piece I ever wrote was a review of Martin Amis, and Carl had sort of X'd 3 words in the first sentence. One was irrefutably, and the other was secure, and I can't remember the third word. So it was really properly frightening. And that's a much gentler process when it's done at Remove. But it's changed the way that magazine culture works, that you don't have this constant va-et-vient.
Do you think it taught you something about writing, having that experience?
Oh, definitely. Well, it sort of accelerated the process. It meant it speeded up having to internalize things, because you didn't want to be told, you didn't want to go through that twice. Yeah. You wanted to learn what the rules were. And I think that was another goal of the paper. I mean, editing as much as you have to, but the ideal thing was always to get writers who you didn't have to edit. And in the sense, if you can get people to internalize the way you want them to write and to get them to write for the editor. And that was the thing you always used to say about the TLS, that it was better when it was anonymous because people wrote for the editors.
So in the old days, the TLS used to only have anonymous contributions. Nobody ever knew who had written them, which of course opened up all sorts of possibilities.
Yes, but I wouldn't go too far on that. I mean, at the TLS, what you did is you came in the morning, you picked a piece out of a box, you made your marks, and you put it in the next box. And I mean, I don't know, of course, this may not be the right thing to say, but the people who did, you had no stake in what you'd done.
And that was very
didn't
different
matter.
on that.
And I think it's that sort of thing was very much to do with Karl, who saw everything as a cause rather than a pastime or whatever.
I mean, that's very interesting because I don't know, we've probably already referred to the paper, which is just the way we talk about the London Review of Books, but which is actually slightly a strange locution. But the paper has a kind of hypostatic life. I mean, it exists somewhere.
I think it's interesting, Mary Kay's use of that word cause. Karl did think of the paper that way, and I think you do too. And I think the best papers have always had that. I mean, going right back, Francis Jeffrey's Edinburgh Review was a cause. Cyril Connolly's Horizon was a cause. You know, it wasn't just, well, I could edit this way for anybody in the magazine. The Tone's a movable feast. I could just do it anywhere. The magazine was a sort of living organism. And the question of taste and tone, well, the editors really, I mean, that's one of the things as a writer, that you might contribute to the tone of the magazine somehow over time, but you don't make it. It's not your invention. It's sort of
but it becomes part of, I mean, the writers who write all the time, it becomes part of
well, that's the relationship really over time. But you put on your best shirt, if you like, for that editor. You're trying your best for those editors. And I think that their sense of the cause can be quite captivating somehow.
And also quite intimidating.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's also one thing, having knocked around journalism, written for lots of different papers at one stage or another, and worked in publishing for a year or so back in the day. And one of the things about the way the paper works is the opposite. It really is the opposite of everyone else. That you have to get very senior, and you have to have been there a long time to be allowed to edit copy, to be before you can change anyone's sentences and before you get to work on text. That's the opposite of how, you know, in journalism, in the papers, a sub-editor is the most junior person, the person who actually interferes with sentences. That's a low-level kind of technical job, whereas at the LRB, that's you have to have been there a long time and shown that you know how to do it before you're allowed to. And in publishing, again, they don't even edit in-house at all now. It's subcontracted out. None of the major publishers have in-house. Yeah, they call it copy editing. And it's outsourced, and incidentally, it's wild. It shows, and it's wildly, variable. I'm reading a big fat biography, which I won't identify now, Lucian Freud, and there are various bits in that where there are almost word for word repetitions, and it's really, you guys I think don't realise at the paper how countercultural that is, that only the big shots actually get to fiddle around with people's sentences. That's the exact opposite of how it normally works.
Right.
And the fiddling around goes down to the absolute minute level. I mean, I don't know, I very, very occasionally write things for the London Review, and the last time I did it, I had the impression of being at a kind of spa, in the sense that people would come down, because I was on a different level of the office, and sort of tend to my prose. And then somebody else would come down and tend to it even further. And this would be a kind of layered process until somebody came down and said, the phrase viable existence, not very good really. Because viable in Latin means living existence. So this is really a tautology. You have to take that out of it. Oh my God, this is just bliss. I mean, some writers don't like it, but I must say I do. I think it's
But there's that mysterious rule as well that when a piece was very heavily edited, you'd almost always get a furious response, an angry denunciation come back, and they'd quote something as a particularly egregious example of editorial interference. And you'd go back and look at the original, and it was the only sentence in the whole thing that hadn't been changed.
Just before going to Sheng Yun, I want to ask you about life, this aspect of things at the Shanghai Review of Books. But one of the things that really has changed, and that also kind of bore upon the rigor and discipline of the process in the early days. I mean, Karl was incredibly tough. I mean, I remember writing my first novel review and staying up very, very late on my birthday until the early hours of the morning and delivering it half a day late. And he just turned to me and said, if you do that again, you will never write this paper again. No, fine. Okay, fine. Like a hand coming down. And one of the reasons for that was that you couldn't keep correcting because the stuff had to go to the typesetters which was rather interestingly called red lion setters, which always seemed rather odd because of the red setter thing. But the red line setters, which are down in Brownlow Mews, and somebody would get on a bicycle and take the copy down there. It would be typeset on big machines, brought back and then pasted up by Bryony Dalefield, who is still with us, doing a slightly different job, but related to that. And then, of course, there would be over matter, because there'd be bits of paper hanging off the page, or holes.
Bromides. Yeah.
And so you had to write or cut on the spot, didn't you? And you don't have to do that now.
Well, I remember when I first arrived at the office, and there was this wonderful sense of chaos and smoke. And one of the people who did the layout was walking across the office with a single word on the end of a scalpel. So this tremendous sense of it could easily have been, 1846. It wasn't Dickens's old house after all, in Tavistock Square.
So, Sheng Yun, how did this must seem sort of slightly quaint and...
Well, I think editing in the world is the same job. Yeah. But we usually edit very heavily of the writer who's from abroad. Like you editing my work, because my English is not my native tongue. So there's a heavy editing of to fit it into Chinese, proper Chinese.
Yes.
And
these are translations, as it were, of
No.
Oh, no.
Yeah, some Chinese who live abroad, expat, they can write, but the language is not quite set into the contemporary mainland sort of style, so we edit it. But there are lots of professors super against editing. Usually they submit a piece and warning you that don't change a word. That if we change something, there's a comma or something, we have to let them know.
And what happens then?
Then they say, oh, you're right.
And how many of you are, if it's a daily publication, that's a lot of work, isn't it?
Yeah, now we publish like one long piece a day, one short piece to go with the long piece.
And how many of you are working on that together?
Actually, not many. There's 4 editors.
4 editors.
And part-timer.
Wow.
So plus altogether, there's 5 to 6 people.
Amazing. And you do the editing on screen, or do you print it off and do it on...
We do editing first round of editing on computer. Then we go to office once a week. Then in the afternoon, we sit together and correct everything on print.
Very good. Well, so, Alan, would you like to read it?
Well, this is part of the account of the lady who came to live in my drive in 1976. Miss Shepherd's daily emergence from the van was highly dramatic. Suddenly, and without warning, the rear door would be flung open to reveal the tattered draperies that masked the terrible interior. There was a pause, then through the veils would be hurled several bulging plastic sacks. Another pause, before slowly and with great caution, one sturdy, slippered leg came feeling for the floor before the other followed, and one had the first sight of the day's wardrobe. Hats were always a feature. A black railwayman's hat with a long neb worn slightly on the skew, so that she looked like a drunken signalman or a French guardsman of the 1880s. There was her Charlie Brown Pictures hat, and in June 1977, an octagonal straw table mat tied on with a chiffon scarf and a bit of cardboard for the peak. She also went in for green eye shades. Her skirts had a telescopic appearance, as they'd often been lengthened many times by the simple expedient of sewing a strip of extra cloth around the hem, though with no attempt at matching. One skirt was made by sewing several orange dusters together. When she fell foul of authority, she put it down to her clothes. Once, late at night, the police rang me from Tunbridge Wells. They'd picked her up on the station, thinking her dress was a nightie. She was indignant. Does it look like a nightie? You see lots of people wearing dresses like this. I don't think this style can have got to Tunbridge Wells yet. Miss Shepherd seldom wore stockings and alternated between black pumps and brown carpet slippers. Her hands and feet were large, and she was what my grandmother would have called a big-boned woman. She was middle class and spoke in a middle-class way, though her querulous and often resentful demeanour tended to obscure this. It wasn't a gentle or a genteel voice. Running through her vocabulary was a streak of schoolgirl slang. She wouldn't say she was tired. She was all done up. Petrol was juice, and if she wasn't keen on doing something, she'd say, "I'm darned if I will." All her conversation was impregnated with the vocabulary of her peculiar brand of Catholic fanaticism. It was the language of the leaflets she wrote, the possibly with which she ended so many of her sentences, an echo of the subject to the Roman Catholic Church in her rites, etc., with which she headed every leaflet. I've had some manure delivered for the garden, and since the manure heap is not far from the van, Miss S is concerned that people passing by might think the smell is coming from there. She wants me to put a notice on the gate to the effect that the smell of the manure is not her. I say no, without adding, as I could, that the manure actually smells much nicer. She had no sense of humour, though she occasionally inadvertently made a joke. At one point, she wasn't feeling very well, and I went out and said, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" She said, "No, I don't want you to go to all that trouble. I'll just have half a cup." Okay.
So let's now talk a little bit about the form of the essay, of the review essay, and the tradition in which the London Review of Books sits. I mean, one of the things that I've always, reflected on is that if you look at something like this or like this, it's really not much different if you open it up from Tate's Edinburgh Magazine or Blackwood's was in the early 19th century. So we're now talking about 200 years ago. And if somebody were teleported here and they saw this, they wouldn't be particularly nonplussed. I mean, they'd find advertisements a bit strange and, aspects of it. Certainly it's printed less close together and so on. Although actually there was a wonderful moment in the early days of the paper when we got a product placement on Coronation Street. And one of the characters said to the other, "You can tell it's clever because it's printed so close together." But I mean, a TLS, certainly if you go back to TLS, when you were working on it, was printed much more closely together than this. But that's about the only difference. And, the actual concept of this review essay, has it... And Andrew, what do you think about that in terms of the 19th century essay and so on?
I think it's been enormously consistent. And if you look at, what's now called the long-form essay or long-form journalism, John and I have done a fair amount of for the paper. I mean, you can see the seeds of that in some of those journals that you were talking about. It sort of dropped out for a while. I mean, when I first arrived at the paper, you did have long pieces, but they weren't as long. The first very long piece was Ronan Bennett's piece about the Guildford Four. And I remember all the discussion, enormous effort to get that piece and to develop it with Ronan and get it. And it was I think it was the longest piece at that point that the paper had ever published. Was it 27,000 words? Yeah. But you would have found pieces like that, obviously in Orwell's time and in back there in Trollope's time too. But the paper dedicated itself to that. Mary Kay's been pretty interested in those, the state of the world pieces, if you like, to call them that. Long reported pieces, sometimes very personal pieces, confessional pieces sometimes.
Well, I was going to say that the memoir, The Lady in the Van, was one of the earliest of these longer pieces that were about people rather than about concepts or philosophical issues or whatever. The paper used to have much more philosophy in it in the early days. Fairly hard graft stuff, I seem to remember.
It's a kind of tonal thing almost. It's always been my impression, certainly, and I felt it working there too, that The paper's attitude was that nothing was lost on it. I mean, as Johnson said, there's nothing too small for such a small thing as man. So Mary Kay would, this is a real example, she could ring you up and say, there's a set of traffic lights at the bottom of Tottenham Court Road that don't work properly. Can you get your shoes on and go out and write a piece about it?
Mary Kay, you're very interested in memoir, aren't you?
I am. I was just about to tell the story of Edward Said, who, when the escalator at Tottenham Court Road had to be fixed, I don't know what was wrong with it, but it took much more than a year, and I got quite interested in this business and why did it hold me up so much. And Peter Campbell was very good at mechanics, or whatever you call that department of knowledge. And I asked him to find out and to write a piece about why it took so long to mend an escalator. And then a little while later, a year or so later, Edward Said said to me, "Why do you never ask me to write pieces like that?"
What did you say? I mean, there were famous cases. There was a female billiard champion who wrote a diary, and there was an undertaker. Do you remember the undertaker piece?
Yes, oh, yeah. Thomas Lynch. He became quite
amazing.
famous.
I mean, we got there first, though, with him.
I think so.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I think one of the things about the essay and about the essay review and things as a form is it's quite difficult to construct a theory sort of explaining it. It just sort of is what the papers ended up publishing, and it's difficult to approach it from the reason why, and it's difficult to construct an abstract or philosophical account of it. It's just, it's in the paper's DNA. It is what has gradually evolved.
You don't think it's to do with the kind of subjective business of those editors, that Carl and Mary Kay, both together and separately, were interested in particular ways of expressing what life was like? No,
I totally think that, but I just meant from the point of view of, as it were, starting with an abstract idea of what the form should be. I don't think it began from a kind of a concern of this is what should be. It was more about particular pieces. And there's been a curious match now with the culture having shifted in favour of long reads and something that's the opposite of the incredibly fragmented attention span we're all being invited to have. I think there's a kind of accidental confluence. One of the reasons the paper's circulation, has grown every year on year for 20 years in a row. I don't think 30 years in a row. I'm sure there isn't another periodical in the world that can say that. And I think there is just a kind of confluence of that with the kinds of things that people increasingly want to read as our attention gets more and more fractured. And I think by pure coincidence, it fits very well with if you're reading on a device or you've got a 40-minute commute or something like that. The kinds of things that the paper has ended up specialising in actually fit very well with it.
And then, of course, the podcast has taken that up as well.
You don't think it's to do with journalism and that... I mean, Carl used to say when I said, "But I can't do it, I can't do it in an hour," and he would say, "Well, you have to, you're a journalist."
That is very important. I mean, I think the thing that one mustn't forget is that this is a journalistic paper.
Yeah.
And that you come from a tradition where the editor is held responsible for the circulation, isn't it? Isn't that right? I mean, the newspaper tradition...
I don't consider myself responsible for the circulation.
Well, I've always been very impressed, Mary Kay, by the fact that you have always been interested in the renewal rate for the subscriptions. I mean, most of the readers, the LRB readers on subscription, and the renewal rate, so the retention rate, the number of people who stay with it.
Well, I don't like to think that people don't like it anymore.
Well, that's exactly right. So there is always a sense of, have people left at the interval, sort of bums on seats kind of metric. And that's a very journalistic frame of mind. So it's not a little magazine frame of mind or even an academic frame of mind where you're not actually worried all that much about whether people are going to buy this thing. And that kind of anxiety, I think, is a hugely important contributor to the nature of what this is.
And I think the other crucial component is, as I say, I don't think there's a kind of theory behind it. I think it's empirical. It's what it's evolved to be. I think the sort of... People used to worry in papers like this New Statesman about the pantomime horse thing, about, politics in the front, literature in the back. I think actually the LRB readers understand very well. You don't have to explain to them the mixture of politics, journalism, history, fiction, philosophy. They get it. And I think one of the ways it works is that magazines, papers, periodicals, they create the readership.
Yes.
That it doesn't begin with an abstract notion of who the reader might be. That you it's an if you build it, they will come thing. That you sort of create an audience for it by doing it. And I think that the history and the trajectory of the paper shows that very clearly. That there once upon a time there wasn't a thing called an LRB reader.
I'll get on to the LRB reader in a second, but I'd just like to ask Sheng Yun, is there a tradition of the essay in China which you feel you're connected to in the work you do?
Yes, and we love memoir piece a lot too, because usually that's where the gossips are. Recently I think a very popular piece is C.T. Xia, who's a very prominent academic on Chinese novels. And he has a lifelong being playboy. And his wife is you can imagine that she's very bitter. So after C.T. Xia passed, and we published a series of essays by his wife. And
Did you?
yeah. So
What did he think
she
about that?
exposed a lot of her late husband's doing, and so then we always comment on in the office that you just have to live longer. Who's the last who have a control of the story?
It's interesting because there's the Alvarez thing, wasn't there? Wasn't it Carl asked?
It was Ursula Craig's.
His divorced wife.
Yes.
Yes.
So what is that?
I didn't hear everything that Chenny said.
Well, it
so
was
I
a very
don't know.
similar situation that day.
Well, Alvarez wrote a book about divorce that had a lot about his ex-wife in it, and then when we asked his ex-wife to review the book, everyone was enraged, said it wasn't fair.
Amazing. Well, just to pick up on this point about the reader, obviously writers, editors, staff, but without the readers, we would be absolutely nothing. So we are very grateful, if there are any readers in the audience, to you for your devotion to the paper and its cause. But this idea of the person who is interested in a whole spectrum of things is absolutely vital to this paper, but also to the tradition of the essay. And it used to be known as the common reader. Then this expression, I think, has gone. But that gives me the opportunity to ask Alan to read from his story, The Uncommon Readers.
I was just thinking about Alvarez. I had to go on an Arts Council tour of Lincolnshire, and Alvarez was one of the people on the panel. And it was just after he'd brought out The Savage God, the book about suicide, and in particular suicide of Sylvia Plath. He always read, we did about 3 gigs a day, and each one he always read the same passage. And I got so that I couldn't hear this without giggling. It was appalling because, there was this tragic account, and I was stifling the giggles. And what impression it made on the school children, God knows. Anyway, this is an extract from The Uncommon Reader, which was a short story I wrote about the Queen, assuming that she'd become an avid reader. E.M. Forster figured in the book, with whom she remembered spending an awkward half hour when she invested him with the CH. Mouse-like and shy, he had said little, and in such a small voice she'd found him almost impossible to communicate with. Still, he was a bit of a dark horse, sitting there with his hands pressed together like something out of Alice in Wonderland. He gave no hint of what he was thinking, and so she was pleasantly surprised to find on reading his biography that he had said afterwards that had he been a boy, he would have fallen in love with her. Of course, he couldn't actually have said this to her face, she realized that, but the more she read, the more she regretted how she intimidated people and wished that writers in particular had the courage to say what they later wrote down. What she was finding also was how one book led to another. Doors kept opening wherever she turned, and the days weren't long enough for the reading she wanted to do. But there was regret too, and mortification at the many opportunities she'd missed. As a child, she'd met Masefield and Walter de la Mare. Nothing much she could have said to them, but she'd met T.S. Eliot too, and there was Priestley and Philip Larkin, and even Ted Hughes, to whom she'd taken a bit of a shine, but who remained nonplussed in her presence. And it was because she had at that time read so little of what they'd written that she could not find anything to say, and they, of course, had not said of much interest to her. What a waste. She made the mistake of mentioning this to her private secretary, Sir Kevin. But ma'am must have been briefed, surely. Of course, said the Queen, but briefing is not reading. In fact, it is the antithesis of reading. Briefing is terse, factual, and to the point. Reading is untidy, discursive, and perpetually inviting. Briefing closes down a subject. Reading opens it up. I wonder whether I can bring Your Majesty back to the visit to the shoe factory in Nuneaton, said Sir Kevin. Next time, said the Queen shortly. Where did I put my book? Having discovered the delights of reading herself, Her Majesty was keen to pass them on. Do you read, Summers? She said to the chauffeur en route for Nuneaton. Read, ma'am. Books. When I get the chance, ma'am. I never seem to find the time. Then that's what a lot of people say. One must make the time. Take this morning. You're going to be sitting outside the town hall waiting for me. You could read then. I have to watch the motor, ma'am. This is the Midlands. Vandalism is universal. With Her Majesty safely delivered into the hands of the Lord Lieutenant, Summers did a precautionary circuit of the motor, then settled down in his seat. Read. Of course he read. Everybody read. He opened the glove compartment and took out his copy of The Sun. Others, notably Norman, were more sympathetic, and from him she made no attempt to hide her shortcomings as a reader or her lack of cultural credentials altogether. Do you know, she said one afternoon as they were reading in her study, do you know the area in which one would truly excel? No, ma'am. The pub quiz. One has been everywhere, seen everything, and though one might have difficulty with pop music and some sport, when it comes to the capital of Zimbabwe, say, or the principal exports of New South Wales, I have all that at my fingertips. And I could do the pop, said Norman. Yes, said the Queen, we would make a good team. Ah, well, the road not travelled. Who's that? Who, ma'am? The road not travelled. Look it up. Norman looked it up in the Dictionary of Quotations to find it was Robert Frost. I know the word for you, said the Queen. Ma'am, you run errands, you change my library books, you look up awkward words in the dictionary and find me quotations. Do you know what you are? I used to be a skivvy, ma'am. Well, you're not a skivvy now. You're my amanuensis.
Now, to finish our discussions, I'd like to turn to the question of politics and the London Review of Books, and in a way, the relationship of the magazine to the culture. The New York Review of Books, the time when it launched the London Review of Books, had a lot of writers who were British. And they mostly came from Oxford and Cambridge, or the London nexus with Oxford and Cambridge. And one of the things that is really true about Britain, I think, is this extremely tight elite system, out of which things like the London Review of Books and New York Review of Books, and New York Review of Books benefited from it. I mean, they were often teased for the fact they had a lot of British writers. But one of the advantages of that was that there was this nexus between the universities in London, literary scene and so on, also had tentacles that went out into the political world. And that used to be very strong. And it wasn't just the London Review of Books, of course, it was the weeklies. I mean, the weeklies in the 70s, The Spectator, The New Statesman, New Society, all those things, The Listener, played a very important part in the political life. And in fact, quite a lot of leading politicians would come into politics via those publications. And they spoke to each other. But this has changed, I think, a bit, hasn't it?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, the Prime Minister is literally the former editor of The Spectator.
Indeed.
And that's working out really well. No, I mean, I think I think there is an odd thing that more increasingly politicians haven't done anything outside politics, and you're having those very narrow, professionalised things, and there certainly isn't that in general easy back and forth, and especially maybe not in Labour politics. There was more of an overlap between a kind of intellectual world and, you know, you had outright avowed intellectuals, Crossman, all that sort of lot in the cabinet, and that's nothing like that is true anymore. There's more of a separation between, you know, this world and that world.
I mean, there's been such a desperate coarsening of the national conversation. We probably need it more now than ever. We can look back in the paper's history to a time when people who were serving MPs or in some way in government, like Conor Cruise O'Brien, for example, or Tam Dalyell, or Eaton Gilmore, people from very different political places could do their daily work, as it were, but also deliver 4,000 or 5,000 words on Albert Camus or the situation in the Falklands, or they were properly engaged through and with the journal. And they saw it as being part of the conversation that we were involved in nationally. The paper, I think, trod a very careful and imaginative line with those writers. I mean, sometimes they were saying things which the editors didn't entirely believe themselves, sometimes they were. The paper's position on the miners' strike, for example, would have caused some discussion. Its position politically since then on any number of issues could be a matter of hot debate in the office, perhaps, but people like Tony Blair wrote a diary, people like Gordon Brown wrote for the paper. It's never been in the business of, as it were, closing its ears entirely to argument, and I think that's been one of its strengths.
But I mean, politics, Mary Kay, has become, I think, increasingly important in the paper during your editorship, would you say?
I don't know whether it's more important. I value it. I worry when we haven't got anything to say about certain things, but I think it's quite interesting when we don't always agree, though on the whole we do, or I'm more likely to keep my mouth shut. But do you think it's more interesting?
I think it's become more current with what's going on. I do feel that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, people say both that there's more politics and that the paper's shifted to the left. I think there is more politics, but I don't think the paper has actually particularly shifted to the left. I think just that the centre ground of politics moves so far right that you're sort of, you know, as well, you're standing what you thought was in the middle of the pitch, and it turns out you're on the extreme left wing just because they repainted the pitch somewhere else. And I remember over things like, you know, the issue that's caused most trouble, we had the most flare-ups and rows over the years, has been about Israel and Palestine. And I don't think the paper's shifted ground at all on that. I remember Carl talking a thing about, you know, when there was some pushback against something that was published in the 80s. Carl writing a rebuttal saying that, in effect, we'd been accused of premature anti-Baconism, which, dates it as an observation. But I think quite a lot of those things that, if you think of the paper's politics, would once have been, as it were, to the right, right of the Labour Party, but that's now a long way to the left of the centre ground.
Palestine is more of a separate issue that gets dealt with, and we're known to have a position on it, and it stands out. Other things, and some of the best pieces, are sort of in between politics and commenting on daily life, as it were. Mm-hmm. And in a way, those are the pieces I prefer.
Well, it's more interesting because party politics makes everything incredibly boring.
Yes.
And it's happened in the media too, of course. The other papers, and what we notice, there was always some of this, of course, but what you notice now is that the paper you buy, are likely to buy, knows exactly what it's saying and to that audience. So the Daily Mail has got exactly the same attitude. It keeps a constant barrage in front of its readers, and its readers like it. But other papers are like that too. The Guardian speaks to its readers. And I think the paper has been particularly good at not assuming that its readers will always agree with it and always think the same thing. So if the pitchfork rabble comes after you because you didn't say what they expected you to say, that's a piece that's likely to have appeared in the London Review as opposed to the Guardian or the Daily Mail.
But the Palestine is still the only issue on which we're very adamant.
Oh yeah, I know, because I used to answer the phone every time you published a piece by Edward Said, and the cancelled subscriptions would be coming fast and furious down the line, as well as the flowery language, which I enjoyed especially. People did phone up, remember?
Yeah. And also, I remember one of Said's pieces that at that point the ads on the website were algorithmically generated by Google. So Edward wrote some piece saying, I think the Oslo Accords were the Palestinian equivalent of the Versailles Treaty.
Yeah.
And the ads on the homepage of the website were for tours to the Holy Land, because they'd seen the word Palestine.
Do you think that it's quite clear that the internet has changed everything?
Well, that's the thing you said earlier on. I said to Nikki that I thought a difference between young editors and very old editors is that young editors edit blocks of text, they edit the argument, they move things about, whereas all I really do is rewrite sentences, and then Nikki replies.
It occurred to me that was probably a reflex of growing up with word processing and moving text very quickly around screens. But the impact of pieces now is quite different. In the 80s, if you published a really, really strong political piece, it went to the readership. It didn't go to anybody else. They might have passed on a copy to somebody. Yeah. But effectively, once it had been published, it was gone. And it had no further reach. Now, obviously, the thing can become viral very, very quickly. We've had pieces that have been read by 2 million people in 48 hours.
And that's new. The technology definitely has changed that a piece can have a reputation among millions of people, sometimes hundreds of thousands, who haven't read it. It's just that they've heard about it, and it's been tweeted a lot, and they have a position on it, that they don't agree with it, because other people that they respect or like have said something against it. And that's the reality of publishing into a digital place.
And it's also, I think, does it increase conformity, do you think? People's worry about the fact that they're going to be... I was sitting here this evening, you think, you have to remind yourself, at least I have to remind myself, that all this is going to go out on the net. The things no longer die. They used to die immediately. So you used to say, Mary Kay, give ephemerality its due. That's what you used to say. And I thought that was really, really wise. You said, why do we want all this stuff to hang around?
Well, that's one of the weird things about the internet, is actually that the paradox of these immediate, transient, tweets are actually there, archived and forever.
Yeah.
And that's a new thing in writing. Maybe it's a sort of even new thing in human culture, the combination of immediacy and permanence. I'm not sure we've ever quite had that before. One thing I would say is in terms of the paper, because it was always thoroughly argued over and picked over, they aren't hot takes. And I think one of the reasons that the pieces often do have that reach and scale is precisely because they weren't written in 30 seconds to an immediate deadline. They have all been, they're all fully cooked before they, as it were, released into the wild. And I think that's one of the ways in which the kind of taking down, we used to talk about the walled garden and the sandbox and all that around the paper, and that those walls being knocked down has been massively to the paper's advantage, just because exactly that thing, you're kind of, it's the editor's in effect saying, "Fly, my pretties, fly," when the new issue comes out.
There's a fantastic side to that. The internet has been wonderful in that way that pieces can go right out into the world. I mean, we were used to a system on the paper where you had your known subscribers. We knew who they were. You had a database full of them. We had their addresses, and there was this. It was never been a paper, in other words, that sold a great proportion of its copies off the newsstand. So we sort of knew who was reading it, didn't we? But now there's this sense of just about anybody, anywhere can read it. And if the pieces are available, that's to say, if they're not behind a paywall, then a piece can, be really in the world in a way. It's been quite exciting to watch how that's happened.
Yes. And it opens up the past as well because of the archive. That's one of the things that's really interesting. That a piece from that amazing Wynne Godley piece from October 1979, saying we might have to leave the EEC. That would once have been completely inaccessible only to someone buried in Colindale newspaper archive, and now, in fact, it can have a sort of afterlife.
There's a quotation by De Quincey when he's talking about Coleridge, and he says, "Worlds of fine feeling lie buried at the bottom of the ocean, never to be recovered by man." Things just disappeared and couldn't be reclaimed. But as Mary Kay pointed out, some of them are better left where they are. Sheng Yun, you publish only on the internet, is that right?
No, yes.
Yes. And what is your readership there? How many people read it?
Well, I think we got a great title because everyone, when they hear of Shanghai Review Books, they know exactly what we want to do, what we're trying to do. And the readership is really educated college students or professors. So
it's very academic, would you say, to a large extent?
Yeah, quite academic.
And how do you communicate with the audience, the readers?
Well, it's free, so it's online. Everyone can read it. But since we go to digital, we lose quite a handful of professors because they prefer paper. And they said, you go digital. So when I have a paper in hand, it's like you serving me a tomato fried egg, and everything is presented in full. And now you go digital, every day you see a piece, another day a piece. So it's like you're serving me eggs and potatoes and salt and sugar in different plates, and we don't like that.
That's very, very interesting. I mean, because of course the magazine on the internet no longer has the shape that it has in print. I mean, there is a shape to each edition, isn't there?
And you're much more likely to read a free stat. The idea, I wonder if we talk more about pieces purely than we used to. We used to talk about the paper, and we used to talk about it's a good issue, it's a less good issue. The focus was much more on the issue, and it is more about pieces now.
I mean, I think that is a real potential problem. It's a potential loss. So I think the founders of the paper, Susanna Clarke, Mary Kay, and Carl Miller, thought of themselves as literary journalists and thought of the relationship between the pieces across the magazine. And there's still that very strongly, that the pieces relate to each other, suggest each other, maybe rub up against each other in an odd way.
But there was always a tradition of saying nobody noticed.
Yeah, there was that. Yeah, there was always that, and there still is. But there's a danger that would be entirely lost, just as a formal thing for those magazine heads who are particularly interested in the way magazines are made, magazines of this sort. I think it would be sad to see that, because it's part of the wit of the paper is seeing how they've made the pieces relate.
Yes. I mean, are your readers, how old, do you know the average age of your readers, Sheng Yun?
Not really.
You haven't done any surveys to find out?
There must be, but I don't know.
Yeah, because we've noticed, I think, that the average age of the paper's readers has gone down through the internet. There are now more young people reading it than before. So, that's so much for all that. I think we come to the last of your readings now, Alan. Thank you.
I was hoping somebody was going to say something about Alan Tyson, who was a great friend of the paper. I remember during the Falklands War, he was a very funny man, very clever. He was a fellow of all souls. He was also a musicologist and a psychoanalyst. Anyway, during the Falklands War, I remember Mary Kay telling me that he'd rung and somebody in the office had said, "How long before the first joke?" And it was in the first sentence. And he said, "What is it this morning? Belle lettre or Belgrano?" But I'm going to tell another joke which has nothing to do with the LRB. Another fellow of All Souls was having a dinner, and he was telling Tyson about it, and he said, "I thought I'd start them off with Jerusalem artichoke soup. And then I thought we could have a salad of Jerusalem artichokes." And Tyson said, "Surely once in Royal David City is enough." Anyway, I'll finish my piece off with a serious piece about, I'm afraid, Brexit. But anyway, what?
Another Tyson joke. I thought while you were looking for whatever you were looking for, I'd do the thing that he was also, after being a musicologist, or while being a musicologist, he was also a practicing psychoanalyst. And he thought the thing to do would be to put up a sign where the patient lying on the sofa could see it, saying, "Least said, soonest mended."
My last entry. Now that Brexit is upon us, I don't find my views have changed at all since the referendum, or been modified by anything that has happened or been said since. It's nothing to do with the economic consequences of the pullout, which are debatable to say the least. But all across Europe, the forces of the far right are gathering strength. This is so in Italy, Hungary, Poland, Germany, and France, and even in what one had always thought of as the sensible countries of Europe, Holland and Denmark. They are bringing with them intolerance, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism, as often as not disguised as common sense. With all our shortcomings, we are still a liberal society. And if there is to be a struggle with the far right, our place is alongside the liberal and social democratic parties in Europe. The flight into Brexit is still being presented as courageous. It isn't. It's cowardice.
So I'd now like to open this up for questions. If you ask a question, please try and make it succinct and a question. And it's a little bit difficult to see. Oh no, perhaps it's getting better. Yes. It's like the dawn coming up. Yeah. There we go. So if you just stick your hand in the air. Hello, it's a gentleman at the front.
I wanted to ask about, you spoke about
Wait, there's a, please speak into the microphone.
You spoke about individual big long-form essay pieces, and I was wondering, when you have a big piece, either in terms of physical size or hard-hitting impact, and thinking particularly about the Grenfell piece, what sort of impact that has on the rest of the magazine in the run-up to it?
Okay.
I didn't hear that.
What impact these big pieces have on the magazine as you have in the run-up? So something like Grenfell. I mean, how does that play in the whole process of producing the magazine? Presumably it's quite disruptive in many ways.
Well, it's only disruptive, what, in the sense of how much room it takes up, or what it, disruptive of the process? No, because you allow for things being longer and shorter.
Yes, but I guess it's often the case that these long pieces are pieces of political reportage, so that they have a different kind of sensitivity to, say, book reviews, which are less dynamic in that way.
Yes, I think that one of the answers, quite honestly, is that we're getting used to that. You know, that we haven't given many whole issues to a single subject. You mentioned Grenfell. That was an example. We sort of learned on the job with that. You know, there are things that worked well with it and there are things that worked less well. It was a very emotional, giant subject on which people had very strong views. Whether they'd read the piece or not, they would have strong views. We might agree. The editor, I was the writer of that particular piece, but I think we would agree that we did as much fact-checking and as much legal work and as much preparation as we could, but you know, we could probably do more. But the fact is, it's a hell of a giant task to get a piece that's 65,000 words long. I mean, that's a book-length piece of non-fiction into the paper. And you've got to remember, I would like to say, you know, we're here to celebrate 40 years of the London Review, but it's a very living organism, something in which things are changing, growing, and we're learning things all the time. I was delighted to write that piece for the paper and felt, you know, it was the only place that one would have written it, actually, at that length. But it's a live situation. And of course, with such an emotional subject, you know that the internet is out there, and there's people, many millions of them, who'd already invested a lot in having made up their minds who were the guilty parties in that case. So the London Review had to publish into that atmosphere, and we did our best.
And I think the thing is to remember also, it's only a 2-week cycle. And we've published getting on for 1,000 editions on the nail for 40 years. Small magazines don't live in that world. And if you're a quarterly magazine, I don't want to name names, but there are quite famous quarterly magazines that have come out late. The London Review of Books has never come out late once.
How would we do that?
Well, it's an interesting question. You were there. So another question. Can you put your hands very boldly in the air? So, gentleman here. Yeah. Yes, yes, you, yes, looking around for the microphone.
Thanks. I know that the LRB has taken some flack in recent years on issues of diversity, proportion of female writers, for instance, and I know more recently there have been some criticisms in terms of sort of ethnic diversity, including the composition of the speakers on these events that you have lined up. And I was just wondering whether you regard those criticisms as legitimate and whether you are doing things to address them.
Yes, I mean, this is an incredibly important question, and the answer to your question simply is, of course, we think this is a legitimate criticism. There are two issues here. There's a gender question and a diversity question. I think, Mary Kay, you would speak to the gender question.
I think the thing with the gender question that people often overlook is that it isn't just a question of numbers. It's also the impact and the influence on the paper. And it's true that there have been more men. We try to improve that and to find more new people anyway, and to find more women writers. But people will send us a list of the writers women who are writers, but not all women who are writers actually, if they think about it, want to write for the London Review of Books. But of course, when you say that, you sound so snotty that you just run out of ways of dealing with it. And you say, yes, we try. But yet we have to rely on the women themselves getting in touch with us. I mean, I remember the letter that she said it was typed and I say it was handwritten from Rosemary Hill 20, 30 years ago, asking if she could write for the paper. And it was obvious from the way she'd written her letter that, anyway, we tried and it worked. Sometimes it doesn't, and people are upset, but I think they aren't always thinking. They're just thinking there's an unfairness or sexism, or I'm not quite sure what it is when it's the fact that I'm a woman, Jean McNichol is a woman. There are 2 assistant editors who are women, so why don't we count? We seem not to. And the other thing is, if you think of the tone of the paper, you think of Jenny Diskey or Anne Enright or
Hilary Mantel, Marina Warner.
Mantel, Marina Warner, and plenty of others who have left more of a mark on the paper. I mean, the men mostly contribute opinion. Should I not have said that? Should I not have said that?
No, that's fine.
But the tone comes much more from Terry Castle or Jenny Diskey or whoever than it does from many men.
Well, it came from you and also from Susanna Clapp. I mean, I remember that in the 80s. Easily the best writers for you and Susanna. I mean, it was just clear in terms of the form itself, the essay. As you say, the men would just dash off stuff, which then had to be
Is that
heavily
how you
edited.
feel about it?
Entirely.
You just dash off stuff.
Just dash off stuff,
Well,
really.
I don't.
I mean, it was
Absolutely
the
not.
case of the man who thought his wife was a hat. You know, Sachs.
Oliver Sacks.
I mean, that was basically written by Mary Kay. If you go and look at the manuscript, I mean, there's not much left.
That's so not true.
So, on the diversity question, the answer is we've done badly, and we must do better, and we know that we must do better. But I'd like, it's not an excuse, but it is a sort of an explanation of a kind of how we hope to do this. Is that you have to remember that the London Review of Books is not just a magazine, but that we have a bookshop which does 100 events a year, and we have a blog which is producing stuff all the time, is publishing very good material all the time. And we're using these as ways of attracting a wider range of writers. And if you go and look at the blog and you look at the event series, you'll find that the spectrum is much wider. But the point is they have to be brought into the magazine, and we definitely know that. And there is no excuse for that, except that it hasn't so far happened, but we will try harder.
I saw it observed recently, and I've observed it, I'm observing it now myself, I guess, that the book reviews in the paper very often don't address the books a great deal.
We get a lot of stick about that.
There you go.
So a 3,000-word piece might have a couple of hundred words about the book in question. And I just wondered what the panel had to say about that.
I'll leave that to Mary Kay, but it's interesting.
But you have to tell me what exactly
he said. That that the proportion of an article that is devoted to the book under review tends to be very small, but he still goes on reading the paper, which is interesting. So you must know the answer to this, but there we go.
I don't know what the answer is. My answer would be, yes, we're at fault. On the other hand, it's more interesting to hear what's in the book than to hear what's wrong with it in chapter 5. I mean, you have to give some idea of what's wrong, but basically you try and show what's interesting. And I don't know, it's never happened to me as a writer, whether one would resent the fact that one's material has been used. I don't think so, because it's still your material in your book. But
and also, the thing is that we're not, it's perfectly self-evident that we are not a book review in that sense. It's perfect when we're not also confined to discussing matters connected with London. So, the thing is, it's neither a review nor about London, but such is life.
But the training...
Let's have another question.
On one more thing. The training I had when I started writing for the paper, and I've sort of now largely internalised, is that the book is an occasion for an essay on the subject. That's the way I was, taught to treat it. And the other thing that comes from Mary Kay is that any sentence that you could put on the back of a book is a bad sentence. So they always take those out. If you put anything that would work as a publisher's quote, that's going straight in the bin.
Sheng Yun, do you suffer from criticisms that the reviews you publish are not about the books that you... No. So you're much more virtuous in that respect.
No, we don't have diversity problem either.
No. This is very good.
Yeah, because it's much easier for us because we don't have that problem. It's all Chinese who's contributing. But we don't have much thing to do with Shanghai either. So
it's a different
very
setting.
different.
I think the gentleman's question is fascinating, though, because it really points to what kind of paper is it. And, yes, you could occasionally mention the book, as long as you don't use the words poignant, moving, touching. So on the back, as John says, that would have to go. But my understanding always was, I think, our understanding that present and past editors shared was that, yes, the book provided the occasion for a review on that subject, but it also took the argument of the book forward. It went further than the book, not just by saying the book was wrong and bad, but actually the right reviewer would pick up on that subject and go further than the book, if possible. And so, as a form of knowledge, the book and its review together would be quite an experience.
Okay, let's have 2 more questions and then wind it up. Oh, goodness, from the balcony, yes. Yes, John, if you could just look, I can't see anybody at all, so if you just give the mic to somebody.
Thank you. One of the things that I've always deeply loved about the LRB is its font. And I was wanting to ask, I think I'm right in saying that the font has stayed the same for 40 years, hasn't it? And I wanted to ask...
No, it hasn't.
Is that right?
No, it's not correct, no. The font. We changed it. I mean, the very important person in the history of the paper, right from the beginning, was Peter Campbell, who died in 2011. And he was the designer of the paper in the first instance. He was also actually quite active in setting up the arrangement of the New York Review of Books in 1979. And we changed to Quadrat sometime in the late 80s, I seem to remember, and we also changed the leading. And that, I think, is the occasional format changes. I mean, there were moments when it got very, very large formatted, the magazine. Do you remember that? Yeah. It became almost square at one point. But basically, it settled down about 1992.
It used to be Plantin for the headings and Times New Roman for the text.
Yes.
And the headings are still
Caslon
Plantin,
or something for the...
Is it still... It's not still Times New Roman.
I think there are people in the audience.
The editors can shout out.
What's the... Old Quadrat.
It's all Quadrat. There you go.
Thank you.
It's in the old days. It's funny about the democratization of fonts because, in the old days there was a thing that the only people who ever talked about fonts never talked about anything else. But it's been opened up much more now, I notice.
Okay, a last question here, lady on the end of the row there.
Do you commission shortcuts and the diary pieces? Or do they just come in? And do you build up a bank of them?
Do
we commission shortcuts and diary pieces, and do we keep a spike of them?
We commission some, and some get sent in. And yes, we do keep them if it's appropriate to keep them, we do.
I mean, bank them for when you need them later.
Yes, we do that, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about diary pieces is that that's the moment in the paper where your antennae are always out looking for people who have an interesting perspective on things. Lighthouse keepers, lock keepers, those kind of things. Mm-hmm.
There are not thousands of them.
No, it's what has made the diary a very nice feature of the paper, I think.
But I remember again the injunction for people who said they wanted to write diaries and were worried about what to say, and you'd always say the same thing. Do you remember what you used to say?
No, what did I say?
They said, just write about what you had for breakfast. And they'd often be completely outraged.
Very good. Well, look, thank you so much for coming this evening. And since a lot of you maybe are readers of the paper, I'd like to thank you for your loyalty to the publication. I'd also like to thank everybody, both people who are here and who are not here, who have worked for the paper over the 40 years that has existed and helped to make it the thing that it is, imperfect though in some respects it remains. Thank you very much.